Hello, class. Hello, class. I hope everyone is safe. Everyone is um, in a good situation back home, back to your houses and back to your communities. These have been intense days and a lot of changes, which requires flexibility from all of us. And here in Rio, I remain well. I'm at home doing my reclusion, and we have to keep up with our routine. We have to recover our routine. So this is the first video of the videos we'll be recording for the wrap up of our course, and I hope we make this exciting and engaging. It's a different form of education, but I think we'll be fine, right? So now, just in terms of the classes that we're having, we're entering a new section, the third part of our course. So we've assessed the planetary boundaries, the limits of the planet. Then we address the sustainable development in the economic and social aspects. So we address poverty, inequality, social impact. And now we're starting to look at the environmental part and the sections on climate change per se and in its nuances, right? All that within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, which by now you should be comfortable. So as we recover our work and we go back to our routine, I think it's important that we're committed with the workload that we have and that we have a discipline. So you don't have to be as rigorous as this New Yorker, but at least myself, I'm keeping up my nice shirt for our class, and that's my habit, so that we have a nice class. In terms of the sessions, right? This is important. So we have 5 sessions remaining: 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, which means classes 8, 9, and 10, and 6.1, 6.2, classes 11 and 12. We have a little bit of additional time, so we don't have to finish our course in the next week. So we have this week, next week, and maybe a few more days if necessary. This is the first video. I'm posting another video for this session, and I'll be posting around probably 1 or 2, but probably 2 videos per session in the future. These videos will be 20, 30 minutes. This might be a little longer because I have a lot of information here to give to you guys. But these sessions should be no longer than 30 minutes, easy to watch with a lot of information, very objective. We have completed assignments 1 and 2. I'm posting the grades today, between today and tomorrow. So you'll be receiving your comments. Let me know if you have any comments. Canvas will be an important communication tool. And quiz number 1, 2, and 3. What I've done, for the future now, for us to finish the course, I've included one more quiz, and taking 5% out of the final assignment. Okay, well, final assignment was 25%, so 1/4 of your final grade. I thought it was a little too much, so included one more quiz and reduced the weight of the final assignment. Okay, so if you have any question on this, let me know. And let's start with our session for today. The session for today, there's 2 readings, one mandatory reading and one optional reading, right? From the book that you know, our course book, not official course book, but we use it, The Age of Sustainable Development. So we're speaking about chapter 12. So please download it and have a look at it, because most of this information is there in some way, and you have even more information there that is certainly complementary. Basically, as you guys know, we're coming from an era where there was actually a lack of access to natural resources. It's weird to think that way, but 200, 300 years ago, it was tough to disseminate, distribute food everywhere, and have an abundance of natural resources. Whereas today we are operating as an overuse of natural resources. This is a gridlock for our economy. It wasn't so much up until last decades of the last century, of the 20th century. But as we turn into 21st century, this really became a gridlock for our society, right? And we'll speak about energy transition and the situation now. Especially because emissions generated, fostered climate change and changes in the climate in general, and the impact that has generated. We will see that there is a correlation between an increase in income, an increase in GDP, and an increase in emissions. So it's not only a problem that we have now, but it's a problem that we have growing. It's a growing problem, a growing issue, because the population tends to grow and productivity, the individual output also tends to grow. Not today, but soon we'll be speaking about the institutional frameworks. Rio in 1992, Rio de Janeiro in 1992 was an important milestone, perhaps the first international global conference on climate change. And since then, the United Nations has established annual conferences. And we'll look at possibilities and solutions for this gridlock that we're facing, right? So, as I said, we come from a moment where the individual output was not a problem for the environment, right? So we, as individuals, as society, back in the 50s and 60s, were not consuming the entire planet capacity to absorb our impact, right? So, but from the 70s onwards, we started operating on a deficit in terms of environmental global capacity, okay? And that becomes a problem because this grows more and more. We did not observe that until the 70s, the 80s, but then in the early 90s, late 80s, this really became an issue to our society and a growing issue, right? So you're familiar with that. But if you look at this chart that I'm showing right now, I think this is probably the fundamental chart of our course. I think this is really crucial. So please pay attention to this. If you need to pause the video to really understand it, on one hand, on the left side, on the upper part, you have emissions, right? So you look at emissions. This is the y-axis, I'm quite sure. When you look at emissions, we have a tendency of increasing emissions, right? And we're now trying to curb that curve, right? To make a downturn on that curve. But if you look to the black dots, we're not following that trajectory, right? And we'll look at adaptation measures and mitigation measures, especially mitigation measures, to reduce that, to reduce the tendency, the trajectory of that curve. If you look at this chart carefully, you understand the Anthropocene idea, because we come from an era where emissions and our impact on the planet wasn't so huge, but now it really becomes a problem, and the projections for the future are not very optimistic, right? But what is the situation today? Well, first of all, I think it's important in the book. Jeffrey Sachs speaks about that briefly, but it is an important note to make a difference between carbon dioxide and CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases, right? CO2 is included in greenhouse gases, but you have a number of different sources of gases that comprise the greenhouse gases idea, right? So you have methane, nitrous oxide, water, vapor water. The idea is that the Earth receives a lot of energy from the sun and receives energy, and because of the layer of greenhouse gases, this energy remains blocked inside the atmosphere, and so we're not able. But this causes global warming. This is one of the effects of global warming. Okay, and if you look at the world sources of emissions, when we speak about emissions, really, there is a slight difference between greenhouse gases and CO2 in terms of percentages. But overall, usually we focus on CO2, and we can follow that idea. Just the idea of emissions, it really it's more a side note rather than something really critical. But I think it's important that you know the difference, right? That if you speak of greenhouse gases, you know what you're talking about. When you speak of CO2 emissions, you know what you're talking about. But in terms of percentages and global percentages, there is a difference, but not so huge. We'll see that too. But right here, you have this chart on CO2 emissions and which are the industries and sectors that most contribute to CO2 emissions, right? So energy production is by far the largest global producer of CO2 emissions, right? Almost 50%, followed by transportation, and followed by manufacturing and industry, right? So there's a huge challenge, as you know, for us to change the way first we produce electricity, and second, the way we manage transportation. Transportation meaning not only vehicles and automobiles. There's a reading there, very interesting on the case. Not Tesla, but an interesting case. But also aviation, international shipping. It's a huge. We'll see in the next chart. I'll speak about this in a little bit, but we'll see that international shipping, right? Shipping produces a lot of CO2. And last but not least, manufacturing and industry, construction, and agribusiness and agriculture, right? These are important emitters, right? And globally, the U.S., this chart is quite interesting because the U.S. remains for the past 20, 30 years with the same level of emissions, so it has not really increased dramatically. But where we really observe a significant increase is in Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, but especially China, right? That's where we really see an increase in emissions. So I just want to highlight one point here that I find interesting. I was speaking of international shipping, and here you see this yellow dot here. It says this yellow part, the second item on the top says international transport, international transportation. So it's literally this international shipping that is not accountable by any country, right? So this is the amount, for example, that international shipping produces in terms of CO2 only, right? And what is the situation in Brazil? I thought it would be interesting to share with you guys the situation in Brazil in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Well, first of all, our energy matrix, not due to climate change, but our energy matrix is somehow based on clean energy. We produce a lot of hydropower because of our geography and because of strategic decisions of our country back in the 50s, 40s, 50s. So and even earlier maybe, we produce a lot. We have a lot of hydropower plants, and we produce energy that way. If you look at globally, many other countries do not follow this energy matrix. They don't have the same energy matrix. So if you look on this chart that I'm showing to you right now, you'll see that actually our energy contribution, the one in red, our energy contribution for emission, which is a bad thing, increased between 1990 when this was first reported. This is because we had a very clean energy matrix because of our strategic decisions, and we needed to reduce the risk and reduce the dependence on one type of source of energy, right? So we actually increase the number in thermal power plants, so plants on oil and on gas. So this led to an increase in in CO2 emissions. Not only that, but also our agribusiness contributes a lot to climate change. So you see here in blue that the line below that agribusiness has an increase, a slight increase on climate change globally. And last, but certainly not least, the way we manage land, right, in general. So issues of deforestation, issues of putting the forest down and burning wood. We had a peak in 2003, 2004. This has reduced significantly, but now 2016, and my guess is that 2017 and 18, it continued this return on increase. It's also an important contributor to climate change, right? Overall, there is an arrow to decrease our overall emissions, but not in such a positive manner. And interestingly, also, if you look on this chart about the Brazilian situation, you observe that our manufacturing and our industries are not so polluting. So it's basically energy, agribusiness, and land management. Let's call it that way, right? And deforestation, right? But in the U.S., it is different. In the U.S., and now look at that, we're not speaking of CO2, but we're speaking of greenhouse gases. Transportation and electricity producing and industry actually play a pretty large role, right? So that's why the challenges that we face in the U.S. are not the same as the challenges that are faced in Brazil. In the U.S., you face many more challenges in terms of energy transition, new energies. We also face that challenge here in Brazil, but the way we manage our land is much more of a serious issue for us. And transportation also is much more of a serious issue because of the American the way the American economy is established, right? So I want to take a moment here and look at these two concepts because they're quite key to the way we think about climate change. So I think the primary concept that we want to have in mind is the idea of mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, right? So basically, every preventive preventive measure that helps reducing the impact of climate change can be considered a mitigation measure, right? So we can really think of mitigation as activities to prevent, to reduce the risk, to reduce the impact of climate change, right? So when you think of the energy sector reform, the energy transition, changing our energy matrix, that's a pretty serious mitigation measure, right? We want to mitigate negative externalities, right? Basically, that's what we're speaking about. When we emit, when we produce CO2, this is a negative externality of our economic model, and we want to mitigate the amount of negative externalities that we produce. We can do that in several ways. So globally, through global measures, through global institutions, we'll be speaking about that today. At national scales, so as we spoke, Brazil is different from the U.S. in terms of greenhouse gas needs, right, or requirements to be changed. So in Brazil, we're more critical on land management, and whereas in the U.S., it's more critical on the energy transition and the amount of energy they consume. So states state level also play a big role in terms of mitigating the impact, and also pretty important, more related to ourselves locally, right? What can I do myself in my community to mitigate the impact of climate change and to work preventive that way, right? There's a lot about carbon capture and sequestration. We will not see this class, but the following class. In terms of the total amount of emissions that we produce today, 50% remains in the atmosphere and 50% is absorbed back by plants, by oceans. To be more precise, I think 46% is absorbed and 54% is remains in the atmosphere. It's the opposite, so around 50%. But we'll be speaking about that in more detail in the following class, not this time. So again, mitigation is when we look at the preventive measures to climate change, right? What caused climate change and how do you address those causes? Adaptation, it's actually how we react to climate change. So what are the adjustments that we make as a consequence, as a result of climate change? We have to make this change. When we studied the Anthropocene, when we visited the Museum of Tomorrow, we saw that for example, natural disasters are going to become more frequent, more intense, and going to affect more people, right? So this requires a lot of adaptation from this side, working on resiliency, working on resettlement, working on even what we're doing today. We're adapting to a global change, right? To a pandemic. So this is adaptation, right? I think actually this is a very good example of adaptation, right? You can argue or not that the pandemic that we're seeing is a result of climate change. That's another debate, but we're certainly being adapted to it. And that can be on individual action, but also policy instruments, technological advance that operate as a result that come to like buffer the impact of climate change. So you think of economic reparation to people who suffer natural disasters. You think of migration flows. Really, this is adaptation to climate change, right? In terms of energy transition, what do we see? Why is that so important in the U.S.? Well, in the U.S., you produce between 7 to 8 times more CO2 than Brazil, right? So to make a shift in that amount of energy produced, it's really critical. Even twice as more, or more than twice as more as China and the European Union. So you really have to address this. That's why it's so critical for you and for Americans. And it's also important globally, but it's I want to highlight this different in and also the intensity of the economy. So although the American economy produces more carbon, China is actually more intense on carbon in their economy. So the U.S. Economy rate for individual output of CO2 is higher than China, but the overall economy of China is much more intense on carbon than the U.S., than the European Union, and then the Brazilian economy, right? Remember the Brazilian chart that we saw at the beginning? Our manufacturing is produces very low, very little amount of greenhouse gas and carbon and CO2, and also transportation, etc. So China is intense in carbon, and this is more significant because, as I said at the beginning, an increase in the GDP, in productivity, is somehow correlated with an increase in emissions. So the more we grow, the more we produce emissions. So not only increase the GDP, but included in that, increasing the population. So the more the population grows, the more emissions we produce, right? So China growing the way they're growing and polluting, having an economy based on carbon the way it is really pose a real challenge for the world. And going back to that gridlock that we were speaking at the beginning. Okay, so the projections are that we remain somehow based on oil. It's not that we're going to shift from oil suddenly, but two important sources are growing fast recently. So one is renewables, right? So that is straightforward, and you guys are fairly comfortable with that. So the amount of renewable energy being produced in our energy matrix is significant. But also another source of energy that actually might be a escape for this challenge is actually natural gas, right? We produce a lot of natural gas globally, so it's not something scarce. And the amount of CO2 emitted by natural gas plants is actually much lower than oil and coal by far. So we will see an increase in the use of natural gas in the future as something hybrid, like not a clean energy per se, not a strict clean energy, but energy that's actually much less that pollutes much less than oil and coal by far. So I think this is important to have in mind, because oftentimes we speak of clean energy, of solar, wind plants, and hydropower, although it's not free of impact. But renewable gas is something that it is important to have in mind, right? And yes, and then this energy transition, it's important to consider the demand of specific countries based on the projection of growth. So China and East and Southeast Asia are certainly require this. Proportionally, we can look at Africa, Middle East, India, but in terms of actual amount, the U.S. and the European Union will increase the need of electricity, but they already, will require an increase in the need of electricity. But those other countries and those other regions will have a proportional increase that is greater than U.S. and the European Union. Okay. So I promised this video wouldn't be longer than 30 minutes. We're hitting, I think, almost 30 minutes. No, if I'm not wrong, 28, 20, 26, 28. I can see that very well. But anyway, yes, just saying that natural gas is an important source of energy that is not as polluting as traditional energy sources. But the forecast is actually challenging to make, right? It's challenging to forecast where this energy consumption will be in the near future, right? We might be with very low demand. We might be with the same amount of demand. Energy projections are complex. A lot of that is due to the impact and the availability, the cost of technology, right? Of new technology. This is kind of a random player in this game, And but you see some projections, especially on renewable um, and natural gas that tend to increase, replacing traditional CO2 based sources, right? Speaking very briefly, and we have a case on this. So speaking very briefly about electric cars. So there's an increase. There's a problem with cost, and also what is the actual impact of electric vehicles, right? In general, I mean they have an impact. They do make a change, but when you look at the total amount of emission, the impact on electric vehicles is actually limited, right? It's really not that significant. Thinking about it in the global perspective, considering all the other sources of emission, right? But they are important. We'll have a specific case about this, and there is an issue of cost, right, and access, right. So again, going back to the technology issue, where technology needs not only to exist but be available and in a price that's actually affordable for people to consume and change um, uh, the sources of energy that people use, right. So kind of having a wrap up here in the energy transition, right? So the transportation factor that we face an increase in aviation demand, and we face this problem of international shipping and international transportation. Um, Electric vehicles are growing in penetration, in amount, but they have limited impact. It might not reduce the oil demand as much as we wanted. Power generation is a huge issue because electricity demand grows. We tend more and more energy. So it's not only about of energy inefficiency, right? So changing old matrix, but also being able to respond to an upcoming amount of energy that is necessary. So it's addressing two blocks of demand at the same time, right? Natural gas is a solution here. It's somehow affordable and personally to me, there's a debate around that, but personally to me, it shouldn't be looked as an enemy, and rather than that, as an ally, because it really can replace fast and cheap existing sources, existing models. Industrial factors demand from region to region. We saw Brazil, the issues of deforestation. We'll speak more about this in the coming class. But other countries really have to look at this, especially East Asia and Southeast Asia, right? So this is the end of the session today. I'll post another video also on class 5.1, and I hope you were well. I hope you enjoyed. Please send any comment, any feedback. This is an experience for us, and I want it to become an engaging and exciting experience. I wish you all the best. I hope you were well, safe where you are, that you're following the instructions, and we'll stay in touch. We'll have a couple of weeks to finish this course, and I'm excited. So all the best from Rio, from Brazil, and speak soon. Bye bye.